What's up, everybody? It's time for the latest episode of Mondays in Middle Earth. We are settling in with the Kindle to read through the latest episode as we continue to clear our way through the entirety of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. We are maybe one day winding down with The Return of the King. I had no idea how in depth the appendices were going to be. We're currently diving into, we're still in section A, and we're getting into the part about Durin's folk. So we've talked about the heirs of Anorion, the heirs of Isildur. We've talked about the House of Eorl. We've talked about the stewards of Gondor. And now we're getting into Durin's folk. Now, I previously did a couple of episodes on, at the beginning of the year, beginning of 2023, I did a couple of experiment episodes that they didn't do enough traffic for me to want to continue doing the series. But for those of you who are interested, I did a couple of episodes on the history of dwarves. I did one that was about the history of the dwarves of Middle Earth, the where did they come from, so on and so forth. And then I did one that was about dwarves in the First Age. And then of course there's room to do the dwarves of the Second Age and the dwarves of the Third Age, but that series didn't take off like I thought it was going to, or everything you do on YouTube is an experiment. And so you did it, you hope it doesn't work out, screw it, move on to the next project. It's like you're throwing things at the wall sometimes to see what works. In any case, dwarves are fun. So today we're going to be getting into everything about dwarves in this episode. If you've never tuned into one of my episodes before, we do these every Monday, usually around 9, 10 p.m. Central Time. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you haven't already done so as we get going here. Support if you can. Super chats on these live streams premieres or super thanks after the fact. Don't forget memberships as well on the channel. And one more really, really important factor here for all dwarfs is that dwarven women have beards. It's confirmed throughout The Hobbit. It's further confirmed in this section of the appendices. It gets quoted a lot. I've used the quote a lot. In any case, let's dive into everything about Durin's folk. So right off the bat, we get told that the beginnings of the dwarves are very strange tales. Both the Eldar and the dwarves themselves tell strange versions of things, but it says here that since these things lie far back beyond our days, little is said of them here. Simply that Durin was the name that the dwarves used for the first of their race, the eldest of the seven fathers, and the ancestor of all of the kings that came after of the line known as Longbeards. It's said here that he originally slept alone, only wakening in the deeps of time of the people he came to, and of that people he came to Azan. I'm going to butcher this name. Azanulbizar, the caves above Keled Zeram in the east of the Misty Mountains, which afterwards were known as the mines of Moria and Khazad-dûm. Said he lived so long that he became known as Durin the Deathless, and we covered this in those other episodes just as an FYI because it's much more greater detail. There's a lot more about the the formation of the dwarves, how they were formed, why they were formed. Um, sort of their place in the history of Middle Earth. It says here, in the end, Durin the Deathless did die before the Elder Days had passed, and his tomb was in Khazad-dûm, but his line never failed. It just continued onwards. And it says, 5 times an heir was born in his house, so like unto his own image, that he was also called Durin. And this is where we get the myth that Durin the Deathless, because not only did he live for a very long time, but he had ancestors that looked and acted so much like him that people were like, oh, he's reincarnated. And this became many of, sort of the strange tales and myths regarding the reincarnation of the Dwarven King kind of sprung up from here. Says at the end of the First Age, the power and wealth of Khazad-dûm had increased and had been enriched by many peoples and lore and craft. And then there were the ancient cities of Nogrod and Belegost and the Blue Mountains, but they were ruined at the breaking of Thangorodrim. The power of Moria endured throughout these times, throughout the Dark Years as they were known, and throughout the dominion of Sauron. And it says here, because even though Eregion was shut, even though Eregion was destroyed and the gates of Moria were shut, the halls of Khazad-dûm were so deep and filled with so many people, and not only that, the dwarves were a strong race that Sauron could never conquer them from without because he didn't have the strength to break into their kingdom. It says here that's why their wealth remained so long unravished, though its people did eventually begin to dwindle because they were shut off from everybody else for so long. Until we get to the Third Age, when Durin was once again king, the sixth of that name, and at this point the power of Sauron had grown much, and the shadow in the forest was looking towards Moria, although no one knew it at the time. All things evil were stirring, it says, and the dwarves began their hunt for Mithril, and just couldn't couldn't fulfill that hunger, couldn't satisfy that craving from within them, um, because it became harder and harder and harder to mine, and so they mined deeper and deeper and deeper until they finally roused from sleep. It says a thing of terror that, flying from Thangorodim, had lain hidden in the foundations of the earth since the coming of the host of the west, a Balrog of Morgoth. Mm. Durin was slain by it, and the year after Nain the first his son, and then the glory of Moria passed, and its people were destroyed or fled far away. I didn't remember that this Balrog had actually flew from the it had ran away from the ruins of Thangorodrim. That's interesting. Most of those that escaped then came into the north under Thrain the First, who was Nain's son. Um, and then he came to the Lonely Mountain, which we know from the tale of the Hobbit, and he began anew there, establishing a new dwarven kingdom, and became known as the King out of the Mountain. He found there, in those halls, the Arkenstone, which became known as the Heart of the Mountain. But Thorin the First uh, left and went into the far north to the Grey Mountains, where most of Durin's folks were gathering, because the mountains were very rich in materials and hadn't been explored yet, although there were dragons there. And it says they began to multiply and become strong again as a race. The dragons, that is, and they eventually made war on the dwarves and plundered everything they had been gathering in the Grey Mountains. And it says Dain the First, together with Thror, his second son, were slain at the doors of his hall by a great cold drake. Most of Durin's folks then abandoned the Grey Mountains, and Gror, Dain's son, went off to the Iron Hills. But Thror, Dain's heir, with Borin, his father's brother, and the remainder of people returned to Erebor to the Great Hall of Thrain, and he brought back the Arkenstone, and then he and his folk began to prosper once again, including through trade, which they had with the men nearby. It says here, they made not only things of wonder and beauty, but weapons and armor. And there's a great traffic of ore between them and their kin in the Iron Hills. And the Northmen who lived between Kelduin and Carnin became strong and drove back all enemies from the east, and the dwarves lived in plenty, and there was feasting and song in the halls of Erebor. There's nothing wrong with feasting and song. It's one of the best parts of living is feasting and song. However, the rumors of the richness of the dwarves continue to spread until we get to Smaug. And now this is where we get into, a section of the story that we already know from The Hobbit. Um, Smaug came down, killed Thror. Everything was destroyed. The town of Dale was destroyed. Smaug went in, took all the gold, and it said here the remnants of Thror's kin escaped, and last of all came by a secret door Thror himself and his son Thrain the Second. They went south and became a nomadic family, and became a long. It says they went into a long and homeless wandering. Years afterwards, Thor, who was now by this point very old and very poor, destitute, gave his son the one great treasure he still possessed, the last of the 7 rings of old. And he went away with only one companion called Nar. And he told his son, Thrain, about the ring. He said, "This may prove the foundation of new fortune for you yet, though that seems unlikely, but it needs gold to breathe gold." So he understands the power of that ring. And Thrain asked him, "Surely you don't think of returning to Erebor?" And he says, "Not at my age. Our vengeance on Smog I order you and your sons to take care of. But I am tired of poverty and the scorn of men. I'm going to go see what I can find. And it says he didn't say where. It does say that he was a little crazed, perhaps with age and misfortune, and long brooding on the previous wealth in Moria and of his forefathers' glory and splendor, and when the dwarves were awesome. Um, but it says here from Dunland, where he was then dwelling, he went north with Nar. They crossed the Redhorn Pass, came into Azenulbizar. Azenulbizar. Yeah. And then Thror came, and it says when he came to Moria, the gate was open. Nar begged him to beware, but he took no heed and walked proudly in as heir of the place, saying, I have returned. But he never came back. Nar stayed nearby for many days in hiding, it says, until one day he heard a loud shout, the blare of a horn, and a body was flung from the steps. Um, Fearing that it was Thror, he crept closer, but then he heard a voice calling out from the gates, Come here, beardling. We can see you. There's no need to be afraid. We need you as a messenger. Nar came out, found that it was indeed the body of Thror, but it had been beheaded. And, yeah. There was an orc laugh in the shadows, and the voice cried out, If beggars will not wait at the door, but sneak in to try thieving, this is what we do to them. If any of your people poke their foul bills in here again, they will fare the same. Tell all of them. Hey everyone, Renfail here with the commercial part of the video where I say, hey, if you like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an update. And thanks to all of our supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, our highest members, our guild champions, Crazy Relative, Remy D here on YouTube. And don't forget, if you want to support, it's really easy. You can do the memberships below, the Adventurers Guild, 3 different tiers. There's also the super thanks on any uploaded video or YouTube short that you find. There's also, of course, the super chats and stickers that you could do on any live stream or premiere, and the Patreon page if you want to dive into the fantasy world that I have with my brother and my wife, which is a tabletop game, a point-and-click adventure game, and a fantasy book series. All are great ways to keep this channel going and me going full-time. Thanks again for those of you who support. Let's get back to the video that you're watching now. Nar turned his head to see who talked and saw branded on the brow in dwarf runes so he could read it the name Azog. And so the name of Azog was branded into the memories of dwarves afterwards. And when he stopped, when Nar stooped to pick up the head, Azog yelled out, Drop it, be off, here's your fee, beggar beard. A small bag struck him. It held a few coins of little worth. It says here, Nor fled down the silver road weeping. Ooh. When he looked back, the orcs had come out and were hacking up the body into little pieces and feeding it to the crows. It's kind of dark stuff here, Tolkien. Nar brought this tale back to Thrain, who, had a long period of mourning. Said for 7 days he mourned and said no word. And it says this was the beginning of the war of the dwarves against the orcs, which was something that took. It was a long time that war went on. It says here it was fought for the most part in the deep places beneath the earth. Thrain sent messengers out, but it took 3 years before the orcs could muster. Durin's folk gathered with the houses of the fathers, and they assailed the orcs in Gundabad from Glendabad to the Gladden. Dwarves were victorious. They hunted Azog in every den under the mountain, and it said at last all the orcs that fled before them were gathered in Moria, and the dwarf host in pursuit came there, and in the great vale between the arms of the mountains about the lake of Keled they saw the ancient gate and their ancient mansions upon the hillside, but there was a lot of orcs there. The last remnants of the orcs that Azog had held back. And it says, while first fortune was against the dwarves, for it was a dark day of winter without sun, and the orcs did not waver and outnumbered them. Eventually, let's see here. The first assault led by Thrain was thrown back with loss. Thrain was driven into woods. Freyrin, his son, fell. Funded, his kinsman, many other. Both Thrain and Thorin were wounded. Until Gror's son drove through the orcs to the very threshold of Moria, crying, Azog, Azog. Oh my goodness. Then Nain stood before the gate and said, Azog, Come out, or is the play in the valley too rough? And when Azog appeared, he was a great orc with a huge ironclad head, yet agile and strong, and came with him many that were similar. Um, and he called Nain another beggar at my door. Must I brand you too? Nain was half blind with rage, made a great stroke with all his strength, but Azog darted aside and kicked his leg. Oof. Nain stumbled forward. Azog hewed his neck. The mail collar withstood the edge, but his neck was broken and he fell. Azog laughed, lifted up his head to let forth a great yell of triumph, but the cry died in his throat, for he saw that all his host in the valley was en route, and the dwarves were killing all of them. And he fled towards the gate, but at this point, a dwarf with a red axe jumped up, Dane Ironfoot, Nain's son, and he caught Azog. It says there he slew him and hewed off his head. It was held as a great feast, for Dane was only a stripling in the reckoning of the dwarves. It says here, long life and many battles lay before him until old but unbowed he fell at last in the War of the Ring. The dwarves on the left took the head of Azog and thrust into its mouth the purse of small money, and they set it on a stake. Oh my goodness. Khazad-dûm is ours, said Thrain after the victory. Oh wow. One eye blinded beyond cure at this point, and a leg wound, and they answered him, Durin's heir you may be, but even with one eye you should see clear. We fought this war for vengeance. Vengeance we have taken, but it is not sweet. If this is victory, then our hands are too small to hold it. And those, it says here, those who were not of Durin's folk said, Khazad-dûm was not our father's house. Because remember, the 7 different fathers all dwelt in different mountain realms. Only Durin's folk, the Longbeards, dwelt in Khazad-dûm as of old. And so the others were like, yeah, this was never our home. We didn't fight for this place. The only thing we're interested in here is treasure. But if we have to go without rewards, then fine. Thrain turned to Dane and said, but surely my own kin will not desert me. And Dane said, no, you are the father of a folk. We have bled for you. We will again, but we will not enter Khazad-dûm. You yourself will not enter Khazad-dûm. Beyond the shadow, Durin's bane still waits. The world must change, and some other power than ours must come before Durin's folk walk again in Moria. So Dane had a little bit of foretelling here. The dwarves dispersed at this point, built pyres, burned the bodies of their kin. Dane took his people out to the Iron Hills. Thrain said to Thorin Oakenshield, some would think the head dearly bought, the head of Azog. At least we have your kingdom for it. Will you come with me back to the anvil, or will you beg your bread at proud doors? Thorin said, to the anvil. Thrain and Thorin gathered who remained, went to Dunland, then wandered more in Eriador until they made a home in exile in the east of Ered Luin beyond the Lune. They made things of iron, prospered a little bit. However, as Thor had said, the ring they had needed gold to breed gold, and they had little to no gold at all. They were forging with iron, and so their fortunes did not prosper as much as they wanted to. Now, here's where we get into the section where it talks about the ring a little bit, that ring of the dwarves. It was believed by the dwarves to be the first of the 7 that was forged, and they say that it was given to Durin the Third, the king of Khazad-dûm, by the elven smiths themselves, and not by Sauron. Though doubtless, it says, his evil power still influenced the ring in some way, since he had aided in the forging of all rings. However, the possessors of this ring in particular did not display it or speak of it, and seldom were they willing to give it up until near death. And it says here, for this reason, no one really ever knew where this ring was or who had it. Some had thought for many years that it remained in Khazad-dûm, in the tombs of the kings, but no one knew if it had been discovered and plundered. It was believed among Durin's heirs kindred that Thror had worn it when he returned to Moria, but that was of course wrong. It was never found on the body of Azog, of course. It may well be, as the dwarves believe, that Sauron had discovered who had this ring, but no one knows for sure. The only power over the dwarves that the rings wielded was to inflame their hearts with the greed of gold and precious things. And if they lacked these things, they were filled with wrath and desire for vengeance on all who deprived them of these things. Um, but it says here, those rings were made at the beginning to resist most steadfastly any domination. The dwarves, that was. Hold on. Yes, I need to reread that section because I read it incorrectly. The dwarves themselves had been built to withstand domination during the Dark Days, and as a result, it was very difficult for them to become enslaved by Shadow or to another will. He said for the same reason their lives were not affected by the Rainy Ring to live longer or shorter because of it. And for this reason, it said Sauron hated the possessors of these dwarven rings more and desired to have them even more because he wanted to dominate. The will to dominate. Says here, partly because of the malice of the ring, that Thrain became restless and discontent, with a lust for gold that never left his mind. It consumed him from within, until finally he began to think of Erebor once again, and said, "You know what? It's time. We got to go back." He didn't tell Thorin about this, but he did share it with Balin and Dwalin and a few others, um, and then went out from there. It said when he was abroad, he was hunted by emissaries of Sauron, wolves, orcs, evil birds, until he finally came upon a night when he and his companions were wandering the land beyond Anduin, driven by a rain to take shelter under the eaves of Mirkwood. And when the companions woke in the morning, he was gone from the camp. And they searched for many days, but they never did find him. And at last they returned to Thorin, and told him, "Hey, man, your dad disappeared." And it wasn't until many years later was it learned that Thrain had been taken alive and brought to the pits of Dol Guldur. He was tormented there. The ring was taken from him, and he alas died there. And that's when Thorin Oakenshield became heir of Durin, but an heir without hope. It says when Thrain was lost, he was already 95 years old, a great dwarf and proud bearing, but he seemed content to remain in Eriador, gaining what wealth he could, um, until he finally had enough to, feel well off. But he says here, the songs always spoke of the lonely mountain far away. And this says, though the years lengthened, the embers in the heart of Thorin grew hot again, and he brooded on the wrongs that had been done to his house, and the evil of dragons and smog, and he thought of war and armies and weapons and alliances. And as his great hammer rang in his forge, his armies were dispersed, alliances broken, the axes of his people were few, and a great anger began to grow inside of him. Oh man, as he smote the red iron on the anvil. This is a great scene, by the way, for this to be filmed. Is like the face of a dwarf just pissed off as he beats the hammer on the anvil and forges weapons, just stewing over all the wrongs to his people and that stupid dragon and that nobody wants to help me and rawr. Until finally there was a chance meeting between Gandalf and Thorin that changed the fortunes of the House of Durin forever. Also led to the story of the Hobbit, as we know. He met Gandalf in Bree. So this is a little bit of a prequel to The Hobbit because there's a conversation here that happens between Gandalf and Thorin while they're staying in Bree. And Gandalf's like, "Look, it's been 20 years since I've been back to the Shire. I'm heading there right now." And Thorin's like, "Well, I've been looking for you for a long time. Been thinking about you." Um, and Thorin is like, "I've got a lot on my mind. Um, like to have a council with you." And Gandalf's like, I'll show up. Um, the Dragon of Erebor is on my mind, and I don't think he will have forgotten the grandson of Thror. And it says here, the story is told elsewhere of what came of that meeting, of course, which is The Hobbit. And of course, we know that, Dane proved to be a great and wise king after that. Dwarves prospered and grew strong again. But it says that with the late summer of the year 2941, Gandalf prevailed upon Saruman and the White Council to attack Dol Guldur. Sauron retreated, went to Mordor. Not long. Even as Gandalf said afterwards, when they dwelt together for 10 minutes, long before the news to come to Gondor of events far away, Gandalf said he grieved at the fall of Thorin, heard that Dane had fallen fighting in the Dale again, called it a heavy loss. Oh, wow. And then we get this, the line of the Dwarves of Erebor as it was set out by Gimli Glowin's son for King Elessar. And that's a huge, I'm not going to go into this if you can even, you probably can't see that, but it's the genealogy tree. Um, It says, whatever you might think of the great battle of Pelennor, do not forget the battles in Dale and the valor of Durin's folk. Think of what might have been. Dragonfire and savage swords in Eriador. There might be no queen in Gondor. But all of that has been averted because I met Thorin Oakenshield one evening at the edge of a spring in Breeze. This is Gandalf making that. Then we get then we get Dis was the daughter of Thrain II, only dwarf woman named in these histories. It was said by Gimli that there were few dwarf women, probably no more than a third of the whole people. They seldom walked abroad except at great need. In voice and appearance, and garb if they must go on journey, are so like to dwarf men that the eyes and ears of other peoples cannot tell them apart, which means dwarven women were bearded, because it's established in The Hobbit and elsewhere that all dwarven men have beards. All of them. It says this has given rise to the foolish opinion among men that there are no dwarf women, and the dwarves grow out of stone. It says many dwarven men do not desire marriage because they are so engrossed in their crafts. It's how it should be for all men. Don't go looking for marriage. If it comes along the way, sure, but focus on your craft first. Talks here a little bit about Gimli, and it says after the fall of Sauron, Gimli brought a part of the dwarf folk of Erebor brought south a part of the dwarf folk of Erebor and became known as the Lord of the Glittering Caves. And he and his people did great works in Gondor and Rohan. For Minas Tirith, they forged gates of mithril and steel to replace those broke by the Witch King. Legolas brought elves out of the greenwood, and they dwelt in Ithilien until King Elessar gave up his life, at which point Legolas followed at last the desires of his heart and sailed over sea. And it says here, this is the end of Appendix A. Here follows one of the last notes in the Red Book. It says here, we have heard tell that Legolas took Gimli Glowin's son with him because of their great friendship, greater than any that has been between an elf and dwarf. If this is true, it is strange indeed that a dwarf would be willing to leave Middle-earth for any love, or that the Eldar would receive him, or that the lords of the West would permit it. But it is said that Gimli went also out of a desire to see again the beauty of Galadriel, and it may be that she, being mighty among the Eldar, obtained this grace for him. But more cannot be said of this matter. So we don't actually know if Gimli actually ever passed on to the other side, but we can assume that it was so. But that is the end of the Appendix A. Yeah, I think we'll do one more video on the on the appendices, and that's going to be on the races, which is going to be Appendix F. So we'll do that next week. I don't really the language stuff, no, but we can do the elves and the men and the dwarves and the hobbits and all the other things. But that'll be next week. So like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. See you next time. Support if you can. Until then, stay safe. Happy reading.